I knew the moment I saw the white paint dripping off my hood that someone had just made a very expensive mistake. The smell hit me first, cheap aerosol, sharp and chemical, cutting through the cool morning air like it didn't belong in a quiet suburban street. Then the silence, the kind that falls when people are watching but pretending they're not. I stood there at the edge of my driveway, keys still warm in my hand, staring at what used to be a $150,000 Mustang. Midnight black, hand-polished, engine tuned, so clean it purred like it had something to prove. Now it looked like a failed art project. Thick streaks of white dragged across the hood, the doors, even the windshield, uneven and careless, like whoever did it wanted to be seen but not stopped. My jaw tightened, but I didn't move. Not yet, because right across the street, leaning against a golf cart like she owned the entire zip code, was Brenda Whitmore, HOA president. Perfect posture, perfect smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. She held a clipboard like it was a badge, tapping it lightly against her palm, watching me take it all in. "We had to bring your vehicle up to community standards," she said, voice smooth, rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for this moment. A few neighbors hovered behind their curtains. Others stood on their porches with coffee cups frozen halfway to their lips. No one said a word. The gravel under my boots crunched louder than usual as I stepped closer to the car, fingers hovering just above the ruined paint. Still tacky, still fresh. Whoever did this hadn't even bothered to wait for it to dry. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, slow and controlled, like pressure building behind a sealed valve. But I didn't give her what she wanted. No shouting, no threats, just a quiet exhale as I straightened up and looked at her. "You authorized this?" I asked. She tilted her head slightly, that smile sharpening just enough to show teeth. "The board did. Your car was violating multiple aesthetic guidelines. We sent notices." "Notices? Right." Thin envelopes I'd skimmed and set aside after long shifts, too tired to play paperwork games with people who thought lawn color was a personality trait. I nodded once, slow, like I was agreeing with her. Let her think she was in control. Let all of them think it. Because the truth was, I'd seen this type before. People who confuse rules with power. People who push just far enough to feel important, never realizing where the actual line is. My thumb brushed over my phone in my pocket, but I didn't pull it out. Not yet. Timing matters. Always has. Brenda took a step forward, heels clicking against the pavement, her perfume drifting across the driveway. Something expensive trying to cover something sour underneath. "This is a community, Mr. Carter," she continued. "We maintain standards here." I let that sit for a second. Then I looked back at my car, at the paint slowly sliding down the curves of the metal, pooling near the edges like it was trying to escape what it had become. And that's when I decided. Not to argue, not to explain, just to let this play out exactly the way she started it. Because what Brenda didn't know was that I don't follow reports. I signed them. The first thing I did was nothing, and that was exactly what threw her off. I slipped my keys back into my pocket, took one last look at the paint slowly hardening under the rising sun, and turned away like it was just another inconvenience I would deal with later. I could feel her eyes tracking me, waiting for the outburst, the argument, the scene she could turn into another violation notice. She did not get it. Instead, I walked past her, boots steady on the pavement, and headed straight into my garage. The air inside still smelled like motor oil and clean steel, a sharp contrast to the chemical sting outside. I reached for a microfiber cloth out of habit, then stopped halfway. No point. This was not something you wiped off. This was something you documented. My phone came out slow this time. I stepped back into the driveway and began taking photos, every angle, every drip line, every fingerprint left in that sloppy paint job. The camera shutter clicked in a steady rhythm, louder than it should have been in the quiet street. Brenda shifted her weight, the faint scrape of her heel against the concrete breaking her confidence just a little. "You should have addressed the notices," she said. But there was a crack in her voice now, small but real. I did not respond. I crouched slightly, capturing the way the paint pooled along the lower panel, the way it had already started to dry unevenly. Details matter. They always do. A couple of neighbors stepped closer, curiosity outweighing caution. I caught their reflections in the chrome that was still visible beneath the mess. No one wanted to be the first to speak. No one wanted to pick a side. That was fine. I straightened up, slid my phone back into my pocket, and finally looked at her again. Really looked this time. The perfect hair, the pressed outfit, the clipboard held just a little tighter than before. Controls slipping, inch by inch. Who applied the paint? I asked, voice level, almost casual. She hesitated, just for a second. It was handled, she replied, deflecting without answering. That was enough. I gave a small nod, like she had just confirmed something important, and turned toward my house again. Inside, the temperature dropped a few degrees, the hum of the air conditioning steady and familiar. I walked straight to the kitchen counter, set my phone down, and let my fingers rest on the edge of the granite. Cool. Solid. Predictable. Unlike what was happening outside. Through the window, I could still see her standing there, watching, waiting for the next move she thought she understood. I picked up the phone again, scrolled past a list of recent calls, and paused on a number I knew by memory. Not because I used it often, but because when I did, things changed. I did not press it yet. Instead, I set the phone back down and poured myself a cup of coffee, the rich smell filling the room, grounding everything. Timing matters. And right now, the best move was letting her believe she had already won. By late afternoon, the street had settled back into its usual routine, but the tension had not gone anywhere. It just sank deeper, like heat trapped under asphalt. I stood at the edge of my window, coffee gone cold in my hand, watching as Brenda made her rounds again, slower this time, like she was checking the perimeter of something she thought she owned. The Mustang sat exactly where I left it, white streaks now dulling as they dried under the Texas sun, turning from glossy defiance into something brittle and permanent. A couple of neighbors lingered longer than usual, walking past with forced casual steps, eyes flicking toward the driveway, and then away like they had seen something they were not supposed to acknowledge. That was the thing about neighborhoods like this. Silence was not peace, it was pressure. And pressure always looks for a release. Around 3:30, a white SUV pulled up beside Brenda's golf cart, engine humming low, door opening with a soft click. A man stepped out, mid-50s, pressed polo, the kind of posture that comes from thinking titles matter more than actions. He shook Brenda's hand like they were closing a deal, not managing a neighborhood. I watched them talk, watched her gesture toward my house, toward the car, her movements sharp and deliberate, rehearsing her version of events before anyone else could question it. That told me something else I needed to know. This was not impulsive. This was planned. I set the empty mug down on the counter, the ceramic tapping lightly against the granite, and picked up my phone again. This time, I did not hesitate. The number rang once, then twice, and then a familiar voice answered, steady and alert like it always was. "This is Carter," I said, keeping it simple. There was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough for recognition to settle in. "Yes, sir," came the response, immediate, professional. "I need a unit to my address. Property damage. Document everything. No lights, no sirens." Another pause, shorter this time. "Understood. En route." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket, feeling the shift happen even before anything moved outside. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. The kind of shift you only notice if you know what to look for. I stepped back outside just as Brenda turned, catching sight of me again. Her smile returned, but it did not sit the same way anymore. Too tight. Too quick. "Decided to handle it the right way?" she called out, voice carrying just enough for the nearby porches to hear. I walked down the driveway slowly, stopping beside the Mustang, running my fingers just above the surface without touching it, like I was measuring something only I could see. "Oh, I am handling it," I said, calm and even. The distant hum of an approaching engine grew louder, not aggressive, not urgent, just present. Brenda's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to me, and for the first time since this started, she did not look completely certain. The SUV beside her went quiet, the man straightening slightly as he noticed it too. I kept my gaze on the car, on the damage, on the details that would matter in a report written by someone who understood exactly what they were looking at. Because this was no longer about a paint job or a neighborhood rule. This was about lines being crossed, and the moment when someone realizes they stepped over one they cannot step back from. And that moment was getting very close. The patrol car rolled in without urgency, just a slow, deliberate glide down the street, tires whispering over pavement like it belonged there, like it always had. No flashing lights, no sirens, just presence. That alone was enough to shift the air. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Even the birds seemed to go quiet for a second, like the entire block understood something had just changed, even if they could not explain it. The cruiser came to a stop a few houses down, engine idling low, and two officers stepped out, calm, composed, scanning without staring. Professionals. They did not rush, and that told me they had already understood the tone of the call. Brenda straightened immediately, clipboard lifting slightly higher against her chest like it could shield her. The man beside her adjusted his stance, smoothing his shirt, trying to project authority that was already starting to slip. I stayed where I was, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the Mustang, close enough to feel the warmth of the metal still holding the afternoon sun. The officers approached, boots steady, eyes moving from the car to the paint, to me, then briefly to Brenda. One of them gave a small nod. Recognition. Subtle, controlled, but there. Not enough for anyone else to catch, but enough for me to know they understood exactly who had made the call. Afternoon. The senior officer said, voice even. We got a report of property damage. I gestured lightly toward the car, letting the evidence speak for itself. Up close, the damage looked worse. The white paint thick in places, thin and streaked in others. Fingerprints visible where someone had pressed too hard or moved too fast. The officer crouched slightly, inspecting without touching, eyes narrowing as he took in the details. His partner circled slowly, documenting with a small camera, the soft click of each photo echoing just enough to make it real. Brenda stepped forward before either of them could say anything else, voice slipping into that practiced tone again. Officers, this has already been addressed by the Homeowners Association, she said, words quick, confident on the surface. This vehicle was in violation of community guidelines, and corrective action was taken under our authority. There it was, said out loud. The senior officer stood up slowly, turning his head just enough to look at her without fully facing her. Ma'am, he replied, calm but firm. We are here to document reported property damage. No emotion, no argument, just a line drawn. Brenda's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then snapped back into place, tighter than before. Well, I am the president of the association, she added, like the title itself should end the conversation. I watched the officer's expression remain completely neutral, but I could see it in his posture. He had heard that before, many times, and it never changed what the law actually said. I let a few seconds pass, letting the weight of the moment settle over the driveway, over the car, over every pair of eyes watching from a safe distance. Then I reached into my pocket, slow, deliberate, and pulled out my badge. The metal caught the light as I held it up just enough for the officers to see clearly, not flashing it, not making a show of it, just presenting a fact. The shift was immediate, subtle to anyone else, but unmistakable if you knew what to look for. Shoulders squared just a little more. Attention sharpened. The senior officer gave a slight nod again, this one more defined. Brenda's expression did not change right away. It took a second, maybe two. Then the realization started to creep in, slow and unwelcome, like a truth she could not talk her way around. And for the first time since this started, she was not the one in control of the story anymore. For a second, nobody said anything, not even the wind. The badge stayed in my hand, steady, catching just enough sunlight to make it impossible to ignore, and the weight of it was not in the metal, it was in what it meant. Brenda's eyes locked onto it, her smile freezing mid-expression, like her face had not gotten the message yet, but her brain already had. The man beside her shifted again, this time less confident, his posture tightening as if he suddenly realized he had stepped into something far outside his comfort zone. The senior officer cleared his throat softly, the kind of sound that resets a room without raising volume. Chief, he said, a single word, respectful, controlled, and that was all it took to seal it. Brenda blinked once, then twice, the color in her face adjusting as she recalculated everything she had said in the last 10 minutes. You did not mention that, she said, her voice still trying to hold on to authority, but it was thinner now, stretched too tight. I slipped the badge back into my pocket without ceremony. You did not ask, I replied, calm, even, the same tone I had used from the beginning. No anger, no rush, just facts. The officer with the camera continued documenting, moving closer to the side panel, capturing the uneven spray lines, the drips, the overspray that had settled into the seams. Each click sounded louder now, sharper, like it carried consequences with it. The senior officer turned slightly toward Brenda. "Ma'am, did you authorize the application of this paint?" he asked, direct, simple, leaving no room to hide behind titles or committees. She hesitated again, longer this time. The clipboard in her hands lowered just a fraction. "The association approved corrective measures," she said, choosing her words carefully, but not carefully enough. The officer nodded once, slow. "That is not what I asked." The silence that followed was heavier than before. I could hear a screen door creak somewhere down the street, someone stepping out just far enough to see, but not be seen. Brenda inhaled, straightening her shoulders, trying to rebuild control out of habit. "Yes," she said finally, the word landing flat. "I approved it." There it was. Clean. Clear. On record. The officer glanced at his partner, then back at me, a subtle exchange that did not need words. Procedure had just shifted. "Thank you," he said, turning slightly as he pulled out a small notepad. "We will include that in the report." Brenda's grip tightened around the clipboard, the edge pressing into her palm. "This is a misunderstanding," she added quickly, stepping forward half a pace. "We have bylaws, regulations, standards that residents agree to when they move in. We are allowed to enforce them." I let that sit for a moment, then shook my head slightly, not dismissive, just precise. "You are allowed to enforce guidelines," I said. "You are not allowed to alter private property without consent." My voice stayed level, but every word landed exactly where it needed to. The man beside her finally spoke, clearing his throat. "Maybe we can resolve this privately," he suggested, forcing a polite tone that did not quite hold. I looked at him for the first time, really looked, measuring. "That option was available before the paint," I replied. Another silence. Longer this time. The kind that stretches until someone understands they have already gone too far. The officer finished writing, tore the page neatly, and slipped it back into place. "We will proceed with documentation and forward this for review," he said, voice steady. "No drama. Just process." But process, when applied correctly, has a way of unraveling things people thought were secure. Brenda's eyes moved from him to me and back again, searching for something to hold on to, something that still belonged to her. She did not find it, because the moment she picked up that spray can, she stopped being the one who made the rules. And now, she was standing in a system she did not control anymore. The officer stepped back just enough to create space, not distance, and that difference mattered more than most people realized. Space meant procedure was about to take over, and procedure does not care about titles printed on neighborhood newsletters. I could hear the faint scratch of a pen finishing its last note, the soft click of the camera shutting off, and the low idle of the cruiser still running at the curb like a steady reminder that this was no longer a private conversation. Brenda shifted again, her weight no longer balanced, her confidence adjusting in real time as she tried to find a version of this situation where she still held leverage. "There has to be some kind of misunderstanding," she said, her voice softer now, recalibrated, less performance and more negotiation. "We were acting in the best interest of the community." The words hung in the air, but they did not land the way she expected. I glanced at the Mustang, at the hardened paint now catching the light in dull streaks, and then back at her. "The community does not own my property," I said, calm and measured. "And intent does not change the outcome." The senior officer nodded slightly, not agreeing out loud, just acknowledging the direction this was heading. His partner stepped closer to him, speaking quietly, low enough that only fragments carried, words like report, authorization, and documentation slipping through the still air. Brenda heard enough to understand, even if she could not hear everything. Her fingers tightened around the clipboard again, then loosened, then tightened once more, like she was trying to hold on to something that kept slipping through her grip. The man beside her leaned in, whispering something that sounded like advice, but it came too late to matter. I reached into my pocket again, not for the badge this time, but for my phone. A few taps, deliberate, controlled, and then I turned the screen slightly toward the senior officer. Photos. Time-stamped. Clear angles of the damage, the fresh paint, the condition of the vehicle before and after. He looked at them for a second longer than necessary, then gave a small nod. "We will include these," he said, voice steady. Evidence had a way of simplifying conversations. Brenda exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the quiet, but not entirely. What happens now? She asked, and that question was different from everything she had said before. It was not a statement. It was not a command. It was uncertainty. I let a second pass before answering, not to build tension, but because the answer deserved precision. Now it goes on record, I said. And once it is on record, it does not stay here. Her eyes shifted toward the cruiser, then back to me, then briefly to the neighbors who were no longer pretending not to watch. The street had changed. Not physically, but the balance had. The officer tore another page from his notepad, handing a copy toward me while keeping the original. Case number is listed here, he said. Follow-up will be handled through the proper channels. Proper channels. Brenda heard that too. The words carried weight she could not redirect or reinterpret. The man beside her finally stepped forward half a pace, attempting one last angle. We can still resolve this internally, he said, tone careful, almost hopeful. I met his gaze evenly. You had that option this morning, I replied. No emphasis, no edge, just truth. Another silence followed, but this one felt different. Not tense, settled, like a line had been drawn and everyone could see it clearly now. The officer gave a final nod, signaling the end of the initial report, and turned toward the cruiser. His partner followed, footsteps measured, leaving behind the quiet echo of process in motion. Brenda stood there, still holding the clipboard, but it looked smaller now, like it had lost whatever authority it once represented. And as the cruiser door closed with a soft, definitive click, the sound carried down the street. Not loud, not dramatic, just final enough to let everyone know that this was no longer her situation to control. The cruiser pulled away without drama, just a slow roll down the street until the sound of the engine faded into the distance, leaving behind something heavier than noise, a kind of quiet that settles after a decision has already been made. I stayed where I was for a moment, letting the stillness sit, feeling the heat from the pavement rise through the soles of my boots, the faint chemical smell of dried paint still hanging in the air like a reminder that this was not over, not even close. Across from me, Brenda had not moved much, but everything about her posture had changed. The shoulders that had been squared with authority earlier were now slightly lowered, the clipboard resting against her side instead of held like a shield. The man beside her leaned in again, speaking quietly, but this time there was no confidence in it, just damage control wrapped in polite tones. I did not need to hear the words to understand the message. They were already behind. I turned back toward the Mustang, running my eyes over the surface again, not with frustration, but with calculation. Every streak, every uneven line, every careless mark was now documented, time-stamped, and connected to a name that had been spoken out loud. That mattered more than the paint itself. I stepped into the garage, the cooler air brushing against my skin, and reached for a small box on the workbench. Inside were maintenance records, service receipts, detailed logs of every modification and inspection the car had gone through since the day I bought it. I flipped through them slowly, the paper edges crisp under my fingers, each document a piece of a larger picture that was about to become very important. Outside, I could hear movement again, footsteps on concrete, a car door closing, the low murmur of voices trying to stay controlled. I stepped back out, box in hand, and set it gently on the hood, careful to avoid the worst of the paint. Brenda noticed immediately, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to understand what I was doing. "What is that?" she asked, the question automatic, but quieter than before. I met her gaze, steady. "Value," I said simply. I opened the box, pulling out a folder and flipping it toward her just enough for her to see the numbers printed clearly, the appraisal, the restoration costs, the documented market value. $150,000, verified and signed. Her eyes scanned it quickly, then again, slower this time, the numbers settling in. The man beside her leaned closer, reading over her shoulder, and I watched the moment it clicked for him too. This was no longer a cosmetic issue. This was financial, legal, structured, the kind of situation that does not get resolved with a meeting and a handshake. I closed the folder calmly and slid it back into the box. "Everything from here moves through official channels," I said, not raising my voice, not adding pressure, just stating what was already in motion. Brenda opened her mouth slightly, like she was about to argue, then stopped. Whatever she was going to say did not make it past the realization forming behind her eyes. Around us, the neighborhood had gone from curious to quiet, the kind of quiet where people start rethinking their assumptions. I picked up the box again and turned toward the house, pausing just long enough to glance back at the car one more time. The paint was drying harder now, locking into place, just like the situation she had created. And the difference was, paint can be removed. Records cannot. The next morning did not come quietly. It came with a different kind of weight, the kind that sits in your chest before your feet even touch the floor. I stepped outside just after sunrise, the air cooler, cleaner, but the smell of that dried paint still lingered faintly, like a reminder that had not fully faded. The Mustang sat exactly where I left it, but now it looked less like damage and more like evidence waiting to be processed. Across the street, Brenda's house was not as still as usual. Her front door opened and closed twice in under a minute, movements sharper, less controlled, like someone trying to stay ahead of something they could not see. A black sedan pulled up shortly after, not a neighbor, not a casual visit. Two men stepped out, suits instead of polos, briefcases instead of clipboards. Lawyers. That part did not surprise me. What did matter was how quickly they showed up. That meant the message had already traveled further than this street. I leaned lightly against the side of the garage, arms folded, watching without staring. The low hum of early morning traffic in the distance mixed with the faint rustle of trees lining the road, but the focus stayed right there, on that driveway, on the people moving in and out like they were trying to contain something that was already spilling over. One of the lawyers glanced toward my house, just for a second, then leaned in closer to Brenda, speaking quickly, controlled, the way professionals do when the situation is no longer theoretical. I could not hear the words, but I did not need to. I had seen that posture before. It was the posture of someone explaining consequences. I pushed off the garage and walked down toward the Mustang, slow, deliberate, the gravel crunching under my boots again, the same sound that started all of this, but now it carried a different tone. One of the lawyers noticed, straightening slightly as I approached the edge of my driveway. "Mr. Carter," he called out, voice polite, measured, carefully neutral. I stopped just short of the curb, giving him enough distance to feel formal, not friendly. "We would like to discuss a possible resolution," he continued, holding his position like he was stepping into a negotiation. Brenda stood just behind him, quieter now, her presence no longer leading, just following. I let a second pass, then another, not to stall, but to make sure the moment stayed exactly where it needed to be. "Resolution was available yesterday," I said, tone even. The lawyer nodded, acknowledging it without arguing. "We understand that, and we are prepared to make this right," he replied, choosing each word with care. "Make this right." I looked past him for a second, at the car, at the hardened paint now catching the early light in dull layers, then back at him. "This is already in motion," I said. "You do not stop process by asking nicely." The second lawyer stepped forward slightly, opening his briefcase just enough to show a stack of documents, prepared, structured, ready to be signed. "We can address damages immediately," he said. "Full restoration, additional compensation, formal apology from the association." The offer hung there, clean, professional, designed to close the gap quickly. I studied it for a moment, not the paper, but the intent behind it. Then I shook my head once slow. "You are not addressing the issue," I said. "You are trying to contain it." The first lawyer exhaled quietly, just enough to show he understood the difference. Behind him, Brenda shifted again, her eyes moving between us, no longer certain where to stand or what to say. The street around us stayed quiet, but it was a different quiet now. Not passive, observant, waiting. I straightened slightly, hands resting loosely at my sides. "You will receive formal notice through the proper channels," I continued. "Until then, nothing changes." The lawyers exchanged a brief glance, a silent acknowledgement that this was no longer something they could wrap up with paperwork on a driveway. They closed the briefcase slowly, stepping back, recalibrating. Brenda remained where she was, the clipboard gone now, replaced by nothing, her hands empty in a way they had not been before. And as the morning light climbed higher, reflecting off the damaged surface of the car, it became clear to everyone watching that this was no longer about a single decision made in arrogance. This was about everything that decision had set in motion, and there was no quick way out of it anymore. 3 days later, the street looked the same, but it did not feel the same. The Mustang was gone, carefully transported under a covered trailer before sunrise, not as a favor, but as part of a documented process that had already moved beyond this neighborhood. In its place, the driveway sat empty, clean, almost too clean, like something important had been removed, and everyone could feel the absence of it. I stood there for a moment with a cup of coffee in my hand, the morning air crisp, the smell of fresh cut grass drifting in from somewhere down the block, ordinary details trying to reclaim space that had been disrupted. Across the street, Brenda's house was quieter than I had ever seen it. No clipboard, no rounds, no morning patrol in that golf cart. The black sedan was gone, replaced by stillness that felt less like control and more like retreat. News travels fast in places like this, not through announcements, but through glances, through lowered voices, through the way people suddenly stop making eye contact when they realize they misjudged a situation. By mid-morning, a certified envelope arrived, thick paper, official seal, the kind that does not get ignored or filed away. I opened it at the kitchen counter, the faint scent of ink and paper rising as I unfolded the documents. Formal acknowledgement of liability. Notice of internal investigation into the association's actions. Temporary suspension of enforcement authority pending review. Each line precise, structured, unavoidable. They had moved quickly, not out of goodwill, but because they understood what happens when something like this leaves the confines of a private boardroom and enters a system built on record and accountability. I set the papers down and looked out the window again. A few neighbors were outside now, moving slower than usual, conversations shorter, more careful. One of them gave a small nod in my direction. Not friendly, not distant, just different. Awareness changes people. Later that afternoon, a different vehicle pulled up in front of Brenda's house. Not a neighbor, not a delivery. She stepped out to meet them, posture controlled but no longer commanding, her movements measured in a way they had not been before. I watched for a second, then turned away. Whatever was happening, there was no longer something I needed to oversee. The process would handle it. That is what process does when it is allowed to work. A week passed, and the updates came through channels that did not involve conversations on sidewalks. Official findings. Confirmed overreach. Financial penalties directed at the association, not just for the damage, but for the unauthorized action itself. Mandatory restructuring of their enforcement policies. Brenda's name appeared in one of the notices, not as a title, but as a responsible party. That was the part that mattered. Titles fade. Records stay. The Mustang came back on a clear morning, restored to a finish deeper than before, every panel corrected, every line precise. The black paint reflecting the sky like nothing had ever touched it. I ran my hand just above the surface, feeling the smoothness without making contact, the same way I had the day this started, but this time there was no damage underneath. Just clarity. Across the street, the curtains shifted slightly, then stilled. No one stepped out. No one said a word. They did not need to. I closed the garage slowly, the soft hum of the door lowering, sealing the space. The sound final without being loud. Because in the end, this was never about a car or a rule or a neighborhood standard. It was about understanding where authority actually comes from, and the difference between thinking you have power and proving you do.